Hello class. In this video we're going to continue our lecture or discussion on some of the strategic tools and techniques that are available to managers. In this video lecture we're going to focus exclusively on Porter's 5 forces analysis. So if you remember back in the first video of module 1 of this chapter, we talked about some of the economic thought that led to different perspectives on strategy. I hope that makes sense. Porter's 5-force analysis comes right out of that industrial organizational perspective, where economists at the time thought a company's competitive advantage or their positioning or how well they perform is a result of what is going on external to the doors of their business, what's going on in the external environment. And if there's a way a company can really understand and possibly manipulate some of those elements in the external environment, they're going to be more competitive and thus more successful. Now what we're going to talk about today, these competitive forces, these industry forces, were really first developed and examined by the federal government because back in the 40s and 50s, their job was to determine which industries could potentially become monopolies. What companies could potentially become monopolies due to the industry factors that were going on. So the government examined this, they looked at this, and then they identified companies where their industries had a tendency to go towards monopolies. And this isn't a good thing. So the government would try to stop these by enacting regulations or doing something that would break up these monopolistic conditions. Well, of course it didn't take long for business people to say, hey, wait a minute, if we could look at these similar factors within our industry and we could find a way to manipulate them to our advantage, then maybe we could gain competitive advantage, be on the verge of being a monopoly hopefully without having government intervention. That doesn't always work, but so Michael Porter first started examining this and again really started examining what are the factors in the environment that have a profound impact on the company and what the company does, and he came up with these 5-force analysis. So the 5 forces are listed there: the threat of new entrant, and we'll talk about these individually, the threat of a new entrant, the bargaining power of the supplier, the bargaining power of the buyer, a threat of substitute products or services, and rivalry among competitors. So those are the 5 forces that exist for just about any industry or any company, right? When we look external, there's going to be competition. Well, what is the intensity of the rivalry? There's going to be possibly new people entering into their industry. How high is that possibility? So that's the key to doing this 5-force analysis. Number one, understand what these 5 forces are and then rate them. It's either going to be low, moderate, or high. So is the threat of a new entrant into our market, is it low, is it moderate, or is it high? And then after we're done rating each of those 5 forces on that scale, we could determine, number one, is this an attractive industry? We could try to better understand maybe what we could do to better position ourselves within this industry. So let's look at each one of these and talk about what exactly these forces mean. Threat of new entrants is very easy, right? What is the possibility of somebody else entering this industry doing the same thing that I'm doing? Now normally the threat of entry is low if there's a lot of barriers to entry, right? One of the biggest barriers is cost. So if I want to start, say, an oil refinery, I'm not going to be able to do that tomorrow because the costs are super high. I need to build these large refining facilities and find the locations for those. So costs are prohibitive. It also might be prohibitive in terms of licenses that I need and certifications that I need. And again, with an oil refinery, you can see it's the same thing, right? I'm going to need government approval. I'm going to need licenses. I'm going to have to go through an approval process, which could take years. So the threat of a new entrant into that industry is pretty low. And you could look at the oil refinery business and nobody really enters it because of the cost restrictions and the barriers. On the flip side, if I wanted to become a business consultant tomorrow, what do I need? Well, I need to register probably as a sole proprietorship. I need to come up with a name, and I probably need to have a computer and some office supplies and maybe a business card. The threat of entry into that industry is high because the cost and the barriers are so low. So, number one, threat of a new entrant, look to see whether it's high, medium, or low. If it's low, it's a much more attractive industry, right? If the threat of a new entrant coming in is low, it's a much more attractive industry than if it's high. Because if it's high, companies can come in all the time, and it's very hard then to manage that that level of competition. The next two, let's kind of take them together: the bargaining power of the buyer and the bargaining power of the supplier. Actually, Porter had to modify this a little bit because when he first started introducing this model back in the late 70s, early 80s, we didn't have the internet. And what the internet did was provide the consumer with a lot of information. Information, in turn, provides knowledge and power and the ability to bargain and negotiate. So if we look at the bargaining power of the buyer, what that means is if I want to go in and buy something, right? How much leeway do I have in terms of price? How much negotiating and bargaining room do I have? If we take let's take the auto industry. If we go back 30, 40 years, it was difficult for the buyer to go in and really have an understanding of the cost of the car to the dealership, right? Whether it was new or used. That information just wasn't available 30, 40 years ago. So you would go in and you'd see the price and you'd say, okay, maybe I could haggle, but I really had no idea what or how much I was haggling on. Nowadays, with the internet, we know exactly the cost of the car to the dealership. We know other dealerships in the area who are offering similar cars. We know the price and the features. So I could walk in there and I could say, look, I can go 10 miles down the road and get the same car for $2,000 less. Are you willing to work with me on this? So my bargaining power increases in that situation. I take the flip side of that with something like an Apple computer. If I walk into an Apple store and an iMac costs $2,000 or $2,500, I'm not going to be able to negotiate that price down. Right? I don't have a lot of bargaining power. I can't say, well, then I'm going to go across the street and buy a similar product or buy another computer. They'll say, well, go ahead. We trust in the features of our computer, so in that situation, the buyer does not have bargaining power. So the iPad, the iPhone, all those things. If there's an industry where the bargaining power of the buyer is low, that's much more attractive than if the bargaining power is high. The bargaining power is high, you could see there'll always be this back and forth, and sometimes profit are a little shaky based on the negotiation and the information that the buyer has. We can look at bargaining power of supplier as the same way. So those people that are supplying us, how much bargaining power do they have? And the same thing holds. A lower amount of bargaining power by the supplier is better than a high amount of bargaining power. So that's bargaining power. Supplier and buyers, those are the competitive forces 2 and 3. Number 4 is a threat of substitute product, and that's just what it sounds like. Is there something the consumer can use in place of what it is that I'm selling, or as a substitute for what it is that I am selling? And an example that I use in class is the sugar industry. For a long time, the sugar industry really had no substitute products. Then along came Sweet and Low and Splenda and some of these other sugar substitutes. They even say substitutes in the title, sugar substitutes. And people would start using those in lieu of using sugar. So, a long time ago when the threat of substitution wasn't there for the sugar industry, it was a much more attractive industry than when substitute products came in. So now I'm competing not only with other sugar refiners, but also with the substitute products. So if there's not a lot of substitutes, if that's low, if the threat of that is low, much more attractive industry. If it's high, it's a much less attractive industry. And you could find substitutes and be clever with substitutes. For example, if I produce insulin for diabetics, A substitute might be just better diet plans or better meal plans that are being proposed out there. So I might be in competition there. So that's the fourth threat of substitute product. The last one is, and probably one of the biggest ones, is the rivalry among competitors. If that rivalry is high and it's intense, it's much less attractive of an industry than if it's on the lower, if rivalry is lower. Maybe I don't have as many competitors, and with few competitors I have, it's not an intense rival. We may be competing on maybe some differentiation within our product or some different features within our products, as opposed to if it's a high level of rivalry, we're probably just ending up competing on price. And when that happens, when you start competing on price, you will start to see a few of those competitors within the industry will eventually start dropping out just based on pure economics. So those are the five forces that Porter outlined. Remember, this has its origins in industrial organizational economics. These forces, in some iteration, were first looked at by the federal government in order to reduce monopolies or monopolistic conditions that could exist within an industry. Later, it was taken by strategists and managers and really developed so that managers could understand the competitive environment in which they were operating, in which they were competing, assessing that, and then seeing which ways they could possibly take advantage of those particular conditions.